All right. Hi, everybody. We are reading Chapter 9 of The Scarlet Letter today by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And Chapter 9 is called The Leech. So this chapter is all about Roger Chillingworth, the doctor. So any reference to the Leech in the book is Roger Chillingworth. And this chapter works a lot like Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 did for Hester and Pearl. It's just a lot of information about what's been going on with Chillingworth and kind of how things are going for him. There's not a whole lot of plot. There is some information, but you don't see a lot of interaction between the different characters here. It's more just the narrator telling you things that have happened. Okay, Chapter 9, The Leech. Under the appellation of Roger Chillingworth, the reader will remember was hidden another name, which its former wearer had resolved should never more be spoken. It has been related how, in the crowd that witnessed Hester Prynne's ignominious exposure, stood a man, elderly, travel-worn, who, just emerging from the perilous wilderness, beheld the woman, in whom he hoped to find embodied the warmth and cheerfulness of home, set up as a type of sin before the people. Her matronly frame was trodden under all men's feet. Infamy was babbling around her in the public marketplace. For her kindred, should the tidings ever reach them, and for the companions of her unspotted life, there remained nothing but the contagion of her dishonor, which would not fail to be distributed in strict accordance and proportion with the intimacy and sacredness of their previous relationship. Then why, since the choice was with himself, should the individual, whose connection with the fallen woman had been the most intimate and sacred of them all, come forward to vindicate his claim to an inheritance so little desirable? He resolved not to be pilloried beside her on her pedestal of shame. Unknown to all but Hester Prynne, and possessing the lock and key of her silence, he chose to withdraw his name from the roll of mankind, and as regarded his former ties and interests, to vanish out of life as completely as if he indeed lay at the bottom of the ocean, whither rumor had long ago consigned him. This purpose once effected, new interests would immediately spring up, and likewise a new purpose. Dark, it is true, if not guilty, but of force enough to engage the full strength of his faculties. Okay, so Roger Chillingworth, remember, was actually Hester's husband from her past, and his name would have been Prynne, but he decides to give himself a new name. He calls himself Roger Chillingworth, and he tells everyone he's a doctor, and he just decides that he's going to live life under this new persona and act like he doesn't know Hester Prynne, that their past together just doesn't exist. Now, why does he do this? The book hinted earlier, and it just reiterates it here, that anyone connected to Hester, either by family or really close friendship, the only thing they're going to gain from associating with Hester at this time is the shame that goes along with being connected to her. So my best comparison for you is if you've ever had a family member, whether it's a cousin or aunt, uncle, parent, whatever the situation, whatever the relation is, if you've ever had a relative that you were less than proud of people making the connection between you because maybe they made some bad choices, maybe they've done something illegal, or maybe they're just difficult, I don't know. And so you're kind of ashamed of that person. You'd rather people not realize you're connected because maybe you're guilty by association, that sort of thing. That's what is going on here. So Chillingworth says that he's not even going to bother. He doesn't want to deal with that shame, so he just pretends he's somebody else. Now, why does this work? I always have students who are like, why don't people recognize him? He's never been there. So he and Hester actually lived in Amsterdam, it's said in the book earlier, and that 2 years ago, he sent Hester ahead. He was supposed to take care of their affairs there in Amsterdam, and then he was supposed to come along behind her on another ship and meet her at Boston. The problem is he just never showed up. So the people of Boston have never seen him, so that's why no one recognizes him. It also mentions that once he has this new name, that he has new interests that spring up and a new purpose, although it's dark. So that new interest or new purpose, as it mentions, would involve him trying to find the identity of the father, because that is something that he has said at two other points in the book that he would find out. And so that is what it's referring to. In pursuance of this resolve, he took up his residence in the Puritan town as Roger Chillingworth, without other introduction than the learning and intelligence of which he possessed more than a common measure. As his studies at a previous period of his life had made him extensively acquainted with the medical science of the day, it was as a physician that he presented himself, and as such was cordially received. Skillful men of the medical and chirurgical profession were of rare occurrence in the colony. They seldom, it would appear, partook of the religious zeal that brought other immigrants across the Atlantic. In their researches into the human frame, it may be that the higher and more subtle faculties of such men were materialized, and that they lost the spiritual view of existence amid the intricacies of that wondrous mechanism, which seemed to involve art enough to comprise all of life within itself. So it talks about the fact that doctors were not, there weren't a lot of doctors in the colonies or in the colony, and that has to do with why they were coming here. So if you go back and you think about the Puritans, why did they come here in the first place? Why did they make this big trip? Well, they were coming for religious freedom. That was kind of their main goal. They wanted to be able to build the society based on religious values that they shared. The problem is with doctors, as doctors, they are men of science. And people who are typically considered men of science don't usually or don't often have the same religious views, because their beliefs are based on scientific evidence rather than faith. And so those doctors have no reason to make this huge trip across the ocean in order to find religious freedom, because that's not something that they value. Because there aren't very many doctors here, the people in Boston are more than happy to accept this guy who shows up and says, "Oh, I'm Roger Chillingworth and I'm a doctor. No, I don't have a diploma, but I'm more than qualified to fill this position." They accept it because they need a doctor. At all events, the health of the good town of Boston, so far as medicine had aught to do with it, had hitherto lain in the guardianship of an aged deacon and apothecary, whose piety and godly deportment were stronger testimonials in his favor than any that he could have produced in the shape of a diploma. The only surgeon was one who combined the occasional exercise of that noble art with the daily and habitual flourish of the razor. To such a professional body, Roger Chillingworth was a brilliant acquisition. He soon manifested his familiarity with the ponderous and imposing machinery of antique physic, in which every remedy contained a multitude of far-fetched and heterogeneous ingredients, as elaborately compounded as if the proposed result had been the elixir of life. In his Indian captivity, moreover, he had gained much knowledge of the properties of native herbs and roots, nor did he conceal from his patients that these simple medicines, nature's boon to the untutored savage, had quite as large a share of his own confidence as the European pharmacopoeia which so many learned doctors had spent centuries in elaborating. This learned stranger was exemplary as regarded at least the outward forms of a religious life, and early after his arrival had chosen for his spiritual guide the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale. So Chillingworth, with his plan to find the father, has established himself in the town as a doctor, and he starts going to church. It says, at least outwardly, he is a perfect Christian. He follows the religion exactly as you would expect. And he chooses Dimsdale for his pastor. The young divine, whose scholar-like renown still lived in Oxford, was considered by his more fervent admirers as little less than a heaven-ordained apostle, destined, should he live and labor for the ordinary term of life, to do as great deeds for the now feeble New England church as the early fathers had achieved for the infancy of the Christian faith. About this period, however, the health of Mr. Dimsdale had evidently begun to fail. By those best acquainted with his habits, the paleness of the young minister's cheek was accounted for by his too earnest devotion to study, his scrupulous fulfillment of parochial duty, and more than all by the fasts and vigils of which he made a frequent practice in order to keep the grossness of this earthly state from clogging and obscuring his spiritual lamp. Some declared that if Mr. Dimmesdale were really going to die, it was cause enough that the world was not worthy to be any longer trodden by his feet. He himself, on the other hand, with characteristic humility, avowed his belief that if Providence should see fit to remove him, it would be because of his own unworthiness to perform its humblest mission here on earth. With all this difference of opinion as to the cause of his decline, there could be no question of the fact. His form grew emaciated. His voice, though still rich and sweet, had a certain melancholy prophecy of decay in it. He was often observed, on any slight alarm or other sudden accident, to put his hand over his heart, with first a flush and then a paleness indicative of pain. Such was the young clergyman's condition, and so imminent the prospect that his dawning light would be extinguished, all untimely, when Roger Chillingworth made his advent to the town. His first entry on the scene, few people could tell whence, dropping down, as it were, out of the sky, or starting from the nether earth, had an aspect of mystery which was easily heightened to the miraculous. Okay, so what it says, or what it's talking about, is that Chillingworth, as I mentioned, chose Dimmesdale's church. And about the time that Chillingworth showed up, Dimmesdale's health started to fail. The people think really, really highly of Dimmesdale. They feel like his health is failing because he works too hard. And it mentions evidence of that there. It said that he had a too earnest devotion to study, his scrupulous fulfillment of parochial duty, and to the many fasts and vigils which he made frequent practice. So we know what it means to fast, meaning to not eat, and vigils. So if he's talking about vigils, it says he holds a lot of them. I find that that's a word that students aren't very familiar with, so, or at least maybe not in as far as what it means. So, excuse me. Vigils, if you think about like a candlelight vigil, if someone's missing or someone has passed away, what do people do at a vigil? Well, they get together and they pray. So when it refers to Dimmesdale's vigils, he would literally just spend hours at a time just praying and talking to God in an attempt, it said, to keep this earthly state from clogging and obscuring his spiritual lamp. So in order to keep clear the lines of communication between himself and God, in order to do a better job as a pastor, that was just something that he did. So that means that not only was he working really hard, but he wasn't eating well, he wasn't sleeping well, and so it kind of makes sense that his health is failing and the people are concerned. So all of that happened around the same time that Chillingworth showed up in town. And so people say they aren't really sure where Chillingworth came from, but some people are willing to guess. So listen to how that comes about, or how that comes to fruition here in the book. He was now known to be a man of skill. It was observed that he gathered herbs and the blossoms of wildflowers, and dug up roots, and plucked off twigs from the forest trees like one acquainted with hidden virtues in what was valueless to common eyes. He was heard to speak of Sir Kenelm Digby and other famous men whose scientific attainments were esteemed hardly less than supernatural, as having been his correspondents or associates. Why, with such rank in the learned world, had he come hither? What could he, whose sphere was in great cities, be seeking in the wilderness? In answer to this query, a rumor gained ground, and however absurd, was entertained by some very sensible people, that heaven had wrought an absolute miracle by transporting an eminent doctor of physic from a German university bodily through the air and setting him down at the door of Mr. Dimmesdale's study. So some people actually believed that Dimsdale was sick, right? And that Chillingworth was sent by God, not just sent by God or led by God to come here, but that God literally picked him up from his university in Georgia and moved him through the air across the ocean and put him down right here where Dimsdale is because Dimsdale needed a doctor. Individuals of wiser faith, indeed, who knew that heaven promotes its purposes without aiming at the stage effect of what is called miraculous interposition, were inclined to see a providential hand in Roger Chillingworth's so opportune arrival. So while others believed that God had a hand in it, they didn't necessarily buy into the idea that God picked him up, carried him through thin air, and dropped him here at Dimsdale's door, but many did believe that God had sent him or led him here. This idea was countenanced by the strong interest which the physician ever manifested in the young clergyman. He attached himself to him as a parishioner and sought to win a friendly regard and confidence from his naturally reserved sensibility. He expressed great alarm at his pastor's state of health, but was anxious to attempt the cure, and if early undertaken, seemed not despondent of a favorable result. The elders, the deacons, the motherly dames, and the young and fair maidens of Mr. Dimsdale's flock were alike importunate that he should make trial of the physician's frankly offered skill. Mr. Dimsdale gently repelled their entreaties. "I need no medicine," said he. But how could the young minister say so, when with every successive Sabbath his cheek was paler and thinner, and his voice more tremulous than before, when it had now become a constant habit, rather than a casual gesture, to press his hand over his heart? Was he weary of his labors? Did he wish to die? These questions were solemnly propounded to Mr. Dimsdale by the elder ministers of Boston and the deacons of his church, who, to use their own phrase, dealt with him on the sin of rejecting the aid which Providence so manifestly held out. He listened in silence and finally promised to confer with the physician. So when people they feel like Chillingworth was sent here to help Dimsdale, and they're telling Dimsdale, look, you need to accept the help. You need to accept the help that Chillingworth is offering. And he says no. He says, I don't need medicine. But they insist. They tell him that because God sent Chillingworth, it would be sinful for him to reject that help that God has obviously sent. So he reluctantly agrees that he will talk to him, which is what happens in the next paragraph. But how could the young minister say so? Oh, I already read that part. Sorry. Were it God's will, said the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale, when in fulfillment of this pledge he requested old Roger Chillingworth's professional advice, I could be well content that my labors and my sorrows and my sins and my pains should shortly end with me, and what is earthly of them be buried in my grave, and the spiritual go with me to my eternal state, rather than that you should put your skill to the proof in my behalf. So even when Dimsdale talks to Chillingworth, as he promised, about being his doctor, he says, I don't really need your help. If it's my time to go, like if God should see fit to take me, then if it's my time, it's my time. And I'm good with that. Chillingworth's response is something along the lines of, that's just what a guy like you would say. Ah, replied Roger Chillingworth, with that quietness which, whether imposed or natural, marked all his deportment. It is thus that a young clergyman is apt to speak. Youthful men, not having taken a deep root, give up their hold of life so easily. And saintly men who walk with God on earth would fain be away to walk with him on the golden pavements of the New Jerusalem. Nay, rejoined the young minister, putting his hand to his heart, with a flush of pain flitting over his brow, were I worthier to walk there, I could be better content to toil here. Good men ever interpret themselves too meanly, said the physician. In this manner, the mysterious old Roger Chillingworth became the medical adviser of the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale, as not only the disease interested the physician, but he was strongly moved to look into the character and qualities of the patient. These two men, so different in age, came gradually to spend much time together. For the sake of the minister's health, and to enable the leech to gather plants with healing balm in them, they took long walks on the seashore or in the forest, mingling various talk with the plash and murmur of the waves and the solemn wind anthem among the treetops. So we have a bit of a bromance sort of being painted here for us. Chillingworth and Dimmesdale start spending a lot of time together so that Chillingworth can try to get to know Dimmesdale well enough to figure out what it is that's exactly wrong with him. And they take these walks along the seashore or in the forest, and that's symbolic in itself because the Puritans believed that any civilized portions, so like inside the village, in the colony, that those areas were ruled by God, while anything that was uncivilized, so anything out in the wilderness and the forest, was considered to be controlled by the devil. And so they take these walks out here because they talk about things that the Puritan community wouldn't necessarily approve of. And so this paragraph is going to go on to talk about that. Dimmesdale actually enjoys being able to talk about some of these subjects because he himself is very intellectual. So he gets to talk about some of these subjects that he couldn't talk about with the other like Puritan ministers. Often, likewise, one was the guest of the other, in his place of study and retirement. There was a fascination for the minister in the company of the man of science, in whom he recognized an intellectual cultivation of no moderate depth or scope, together with a range and freedom of ideas that he would have vainly looked for among the members of his own profession. In truth, he was startled, if not shocked, to find this attribute in the physician. Mr. Dimmesdale was a true priest, a true religionist, with the reverential sentiment largely developed, and an order of mind that impelled itself powerfully along the track of the creed, and wore its path continually deeper with the lapse of time. In no state of society would he have been what is called a man of liberal views. It would always be essential to his peace to feel the pressure of a faith about him, supporting, while it confined him within its iron framework. Not the less, however, though with a tremulous enjoyment, he did feel the occasional relief of looking at the universe through the medium of another kind of intellect than those with which he habitually held converse. It was as if a window were thrown open, admitting a freer atmosphere into the close and stifled study, where his life was wasting itself away amid lamplight or obstructed daybeams, and the musty fragrance, be it sensual or moral, that exhales from books. But the air was too fresh and chill to be long breathed with comfort, so the minister and the physician with him withdrew again within the limits of what their church defined as orthodox. So, like I said, they occasionally have these conversations on topics that the church wouldn't necessarily have been accepting of. Dimmesdale is by no means a liberal, but he enjoys like having the opportunity to have these conversations, at least sometimes. It's like a chance to give him a bit of a break. Thus Roger Chillingworth scrutinized his patient carefully, both as he saw him in his ordinary life, keeping an accustomed pathway in the range of thoughts familiar to him, and as he appeared when thrown amidst other moral scenery, the novelty of which might call out something new to the surface of his character. He deemed it essential, it would seem, to know the man, before attempting to do him good. Wherever there is a heart and an intellect, the diseases of the physical frame are tinged with the peculiarities of these. In Arthur Dimmesdale, thought and imagination were so active and sensibility so intense that the bodily infirmity would be likely to have its groundwork there. So Roger Chillingworth, the man of skill, the kind and friendly physician, strove to go deep into his patient's bosom, delving among his principles, prying into his recollections, and probing everything with a cautious touch, like a treasure seeker in a dark cavern. Few secrets can escape an investigator who has opportunity and license to undertake such a quest and skill to follow it up. A man burdened with a secret should especially avoid the intimacy of his physician, If the latter possesses native sagacity and a nameless something more, let us call it intuition, if he's shown no intrusive egotism, nor disagreeably prominent characteristics of his own, if he have the power which must be born with him, to bring his mind into such affinity with his patients, then this last shall unawares have spoken what he imagines himself only to have thought. If such revelations be received without tumult and acknowledged not so often by an uttered sympathy as by silence, in an inarticulate breath, and here and there a word to indicate that all is understood, if to those qualifications of a confidant be joined the advantages afforded by his recognized character as a physician, then at some inevitable moment will the soul of the sufferer be dissolved and flow forth in a dark but transparent stream, bringing all its mysteries into the daylight. So that's a really long paragraph, but if I'm trying to sum it up very quickly, Chillingworth feels like it's really important that he knows his patients well enough to kind of know what they're thinking even before they say it so that he can treat them better. And the belief was that especially someone like Dimmesdale, who's very sensitive, that the disease that he is having in his body may be rooted somewhere else. So the comparison that I gave in one class period, at least today, was comparing it to like a substance abuse situation, just because I think that's something that you guys can understand well enough to know that some people have addictive personalities, like they just have a tendency to be addicted to things or to abuse substances. And typically the belief is that those tendencies are rooted in something else, like something in our mind. Maybe it's depression, or maybe it's some other psychological type situation. And so that's what this book is really talking about. Chillingworth's trying to figure out, because Dimmesdale is such a sensitive type guy, maybe there's something more to explain why he's so sick. And so he spends a lot of time trying to figure out or get to know him well for that reason. Roger Chillingworth possessed all or most of the attributes above enumerated. Nevertheless, time went on. A kind of intimacy, as we have said, grew up between these two cultivated minds, which had as wide a field as the whole sphere of human thought and study to meet upon. They discussed every topic of ethics and religion, of public affairs and private character. They talked much on both sides of matters, and seemed personal to themselves, and yet no secret, such as the physician fancied must exist there, ever stole out of the minister's consciousness into his companion's ear. The latter had his suspicions, indeed, that even the nature of Mr. Dimmesdale's bodily disease had never fairly been revealed to him. It was a strange reserve. So in all his efforts, Chillingworth feels like there's something there that he's missing, that Dimmesdale's not telling him, whether about his physical infirmity or something else that's going on. So he just keeps trying to figure it out. After a time, at a hint from Roger Chillingworth, the friends of Mr. Dimmesdale effected an arrangement by which the two were lodged in the same house, so that every ebb and flow of the minister's lifetide might pass under the eye of his anxious and attached physician. There was much joy throughout the town when this greatly desirable object was attained. It was held to be the best possible measure for the young clergyman's welfare, unless, indeed, as often urged by such as felt authorized to do so, he had selected some one of the many blooming damsels, spiritually devoted to him, to become his devoted wife. This latter step, however, there was no present prospect that Arthur Dimmesdale would be prevailed upon to take. He rejected all suggestions of the kind, as if priestly celibacy were one of his articles of church discipline. Doomed by his own choice, therefore, as Mr. Dimmesdale so evidently was, to eat his unsavory morsels always at another's board, and endure the lifelong chill which must be his lot, who seeks to warm himself only at another's fireside. It truly seemed that this sagacious, experienced, benevolent old physician, with his concord of paternal and reverential love for the young pastor, was the very man of all mankind to be constantly within reach of his voice. So the people of the town had made arrangements for Dimmesdale and Chillingworth to live at the same house. This was something that they really thought was important. It mentioned that it was Chillingworth's idea so that he could keep a better eye on Dimmesdale and take better care of him. The only thing that the townspeople would have enjoyed more would be if Dimmesdale took a wife, and there just aren't any prospects of that. He doesn't seem to be interested in finding a wife. The new abode of the two friends was with a pious widow of good social rank who dwelt in a house covering pretty nearly the site on which the venerable structure of King's Chapel has since been built. It had the graveyard, originally Isaac Johnson's home field, on one side, and so well adapted to call up serious reflections suited to their respective employments in both minister and man of physic. The motherly care of the good widow assigned to Mr. Dimmesdale a front apartment with a sunny exposure and heavy window curtains to create a noontide shadow when desirable. The walls were hung round with tapestry, said to be from the Gobelin looms, and at all events representing the scriptural story of David and Bathsheba and Nathan the prophet in colors still unfaded, but which made the fair woman of the scene almost as grimly picturesque as the woe-denouncing seer. Here the pale clergyman piled up his library, rich with parchment-bound folios of the fathers and the lore of rabbis and monkish erudition, of which the Protestant divines, even while they vilified and decried that class of writers, were yet constrained often to avail themselves. On the other side of the house, old Roger Chillingworth arranged his study and laboratory, not such as a modern man of science would reckon even tolerably complete, but provided with the distilling apparatus and the means of compounding drugs and chemicals, which the practiced alchemist knew well how to turn to purpose. With such commodiousness of situation, these two learned persons sat themselves down, each in his own domain, yet familiarly passing from one apartment to the other, and bestowing a mutual and not incurious inspection into one another's business. So while they each have their own room, they still seem to spend quite a bit of time together, or they see each other a lot in the house, even though they have their own rooms. Sometimes Dimmesdale goes to Chillingworth's room, sometimes Chillingworth goes to his room so they can just hang out. And the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale's best discerning friends, as we have intimated, very reasonably imagined that the hand of Providence had done all this for the purpose, besought in so many public and domestic and secret prayers, of restoring the young minister to health. So a lot of Dimmesdale's friends have had the belief that Chillingworth was brought here in order to heal Dimmesdale. But it must now be said, another portion of the community had latterly begun to take its own view of the relation betwixt Mr. Dimmesdale and the mysterious old physician. When an uninstructed multitude attempts to see with its eyes, it is exceedingly apt to be deceived. When, however, it forms its judgment, as it usually does, on the intuitions of its great and warm heart, the conclusions thus attained are often so profound and so unerring as to possess the character of truths supernaturally revealed. The people in the case of which we speak could justify its prejudice against Roger Chillingworth by no fact or argument worthy of serious refutation. So some people didn't like Chillingworth, and they did not have a good reason. They just didn't. There was an aged handicraftsman, it is true, who had been a citizen of London at the period of Sir Thomas Overby's murder, now some 30 years agone. He testified to having seen the physician under some other name, which the narrator of the story had now forgotten, in company with Dr. Foreman, the famous old conjurer who was implicated in the affair of Overbury. 2 or 3 individuals hinted that the man of skill during his Indian captivity had enlarged his medical attainments by joining in the incantations of the savage priests, who were universally acknowledged to be powerful enchanters, often performing seemingly miraculous cures by their skill in the black art. A large number, and many of them were persons of such sober sense and practical observation that their opinions would have been valuable in other matters, affirmed that Roger Chillingworth's aspect had undergone a remarkable change while he had dwelt in town, and especially since his abode with Mr. Dimmesdale. So, to just recap a little bit, one guy said that he swears he saw Chillingworth hanging out with this shady guy back in the old world, meaning like England, but he was under a different name. So we don't know if that's necessarily true, but someone says he knew him under another name. Some other people say that he learned a lot of his medicine from Indian conjurers, which are like medicine men. They had like black magic, like they did dark stuff. But they also noted how much Roger Chillingworth's appearance has changed since he's come to town, especially since he and Dimmesdale have moved in together. At first, his expression had been calm, meditative, scholar-like. So that's Chillingworth when he first came to town. Now there was something ugly and evil in his face, which they had not previously noticed, and which grew still the more obvious to sight the oftener they looked upon him. According to the vulgar idea, the fire in his laboratory had been brought from the lower regions and was fed with infernal fuel, and so, as might be expected, his visage was getting sooty with the smoke. So the idea that his fire in his lab came from the lower regions and was fed with infernal fuel, it's referring to hell. And so it says that his visage, his face, has become darker. It's like sooty from the smoke from the fires in hell. To sum up the matter, it grew to be a widely diffused opinion that the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, like many other personages of a special sanctity in all ages of the Christian world, was haunted either by Satan himself or Satan's emissary in the guise of old Roger Chillingworth. This diabolical agent had the divine permission for a season to burrow into the clergyman's intimacy and plot against his soul. No sensible man, it was confessed, could doubt on which side the victory would turn. The people looked with an unshaken hope to see the minister come forth out of the conflict transfigured with the glory which he would unquestionably win. Meanwhile, nevertheless, it was sad to think of the perchance mortal agony through which he must struggle towards his triumph. Alas, to judge from the gloom and terror in the depths of the poor minister's eyes, the battle was a sore one, and the victory anything but secure. Okay, so there at the end, there is a group of people, not like a particular group, but there are some people who feel like Chillingworth wasn't sent by God, that he was actually sent by the devil, or the devil himself has taken over Chillingworth's body and he has come just to do battle with Dimmesdale, because Dimmesdale is so good, so saintly, like an angel on earth, that Satan's trying to take his soul, because that would be a huge victory for him. And so they kind of sit back. They fully expect Dimmesdale to win if it is the devil that he's up against. But it says that if you looked into his eyes, you would be a lot less certain of that victory for Dimmesdale. And that is the end of chapter 9. So a quick review. This chapter loads us up with a ton of information about Roger Chillingworth, how he established himself in town as a doctor, and why they are so ready to accept that. It also tells us that Chillingworth chose Dimmesdale as his pastor. That's the church he was going to, and that then he became Dimmesdale's doctor. Some believe that God sent Chillingworth in order to heal Dimmesdale because they think he works too hard, and that's what's got him down. The men, Chillingworth and Dimmesdale, spend a ton of time together. They even move into the same boarding house because Dimmesdale's very ill. He just seems to be getting worse and worse. So Dimmesdale's symptoms, it talks about his voice, it talks about his eyes, it talks about the fact he's emaciated, so he's very thin. It also talks about he's always putting his hand over his heart, like he's in pain. Maybe, I don't want to compare it to a heart attack, but that's always what I think of when it acts like he kind of clutches his chest in pain. And then lastly, it says that Chillingworth is initially looked at as that blessing, but then as Dimmesdale's health seems to get worse, many start to consider Chillingworth as evil. There's more to come in the next chapter. In chapter 10, we'll find out some more about the relationship between those two guys and what exactly is going on. So, hope you enjoyed.